Kathy. Thank you, everybody, for hanging around to listen to us. And as Kathy said, I'm presenting on behalf of both Mike and myself on this topic of using quality management, or QM, to improve language testing. And I hope it's the broad topic of QM which might be applicable to the symposium as a whole. This is my outline, and you should have a handout with this on it and some slides. I've picked out a few slides in particular because some of them are quite small. There's three figures which I'd like you to have a look at when I refer to them, and they're on the slides, on the handout. I'm going to start by going through introducing the concept of quality management systems. I'm going to look a little bit at some historical perspectives and the definition of quality management. And I'm going to focus in particular on some key points within that approach to do with people and processes, those two Ps. And then a little bit more fine-grained look at activities which take place within a quality management system related to both quality control and quality assurance, and drawing a distinction between the two. And finally, I'll be linking the concepts of quality and validation in the conclusion. Okay. Quality management system, QMS, or in other words, getting it right every time. So in this paper, we present and discuss the core processes required in developing and administering language tests, and make the case for adopting a quality management or QM approach to improve testing and to ensure that appropriate professional standards are met. We argue that language test developers need to adopt the kind of managerial practices which enable successful organizations to implement error-free processes. In making this case, it's important to define what quality means in the context of language assessment, and to describe how a QM-based approach can help to achieve the required quality goals and, at the same time, enhance a validity argument. We suggest that it is possible to ensure that processes are continually improved and standards raised, in keeping with the concept of validation as a long-term and ongoing activity. A key point in our argument, and perhaps one of the take-home messages, is the necessary convergence between the twin concepts of quality on the one hand and validity on the other. QM provides an appropriate basis for guaranteeing the consistency of the processes which underpin a validity argument, and provides the tools and techniques for linking theoretical concerns with the practical realities of setting up and administering assessment systems. First of all, though, a quick definition or distinguishing between the terms. Within this approach, this QM approach, a distinction is made normally between quality management as an overarching concept and quality control and quality assurance, which are activities or procedures for checking and ensuring quality within the overall approach. So this means that QM is concerned with the management of processes which ultimately lead to improvements being implemented, and not just simply checking out whether you're doing the right thing. There's also another key concept, which is related to what in the jargon is sometimes called customer satisfaction, or in QM terms, meeting client needs in an appropriate way. Client in this case might be considered client as they use it in the health service or in the social sciences, which is the person or group of people or institution that makes use of the services or products that are being produced. So who is a client in language testing? Well, obviously test takers who take tests, but also a whole range of secondary users, sponsors of the test takers, sponsors of tests, users of the results to make decisions and so on. And this primary secondary distinction is made in, for example, the Code of Fair Testing Practices, which many of us use in our definition of codes of practice. So this means that a testing organization needs to guarantee what I call fitness for purpose, to meet client needs for assessment in specific contexts of use. And here's a link with the theme of the symposium. For example, the context being the workplace, and the clients being those who need the testing in that context. So where does all of this come from? Well, the origins, of course, are in the manufacturing sector, producing products usually. But now it's applied across many types of organisation, including in the service sectors and in the social sciences, for example. Recently, also within educational systems, and perhaps even more recently, within language assessment. And if you haven't come across this reference, I think it's a very good book. Wild and Ramaswamy, 2008, editors of this volume entitled Improving Testing, Applying Process Tools and Techniques to Assure Quality. So they're talking about assurance in their book. This comes back, though, a long way. The quality management idea, founding fathers in this case, Taylor and Shewart, where they moved the focus from maintaining standards to improving standards. So this idea of continual improvement is axiomatic in all forms of QM system. It's focused on being precise and declarative about the nature of the processes in terms of inputs and outputs, and above all, how the things you're doing link together and can be managed to create a coherent whole within the context of an organization. The aim is to reduce defective things, items of whatever you're doing, in our case could be test item, before the final stage of a process, so that you cut out the cost of post hoc inspections or having to put the problem right after you've already done it. Some of you may be familiar with the idea of total quality management, and this perhaps was the first coherent QM model. It comes from this leading writer, W. Edwards Deming, who wrote a very influential book in the 1980s called Out of the Crisis. And some people attribute the success of the Japanese manufacturing sector to some of his ideas. There's also a twin track on this, which you might call quality standards, and mechanisms for accrediting that quality has been achieved, and therefore a mechanism of accountability. This also dates back a fair way. For example, in England, the British Standards Institution was set up in the early 1900s and came out with what I think is the original quality mark, which we call in the UK the kite mark because of its distinctive form. And you will be familiar with the similar things in the USA, like ANSI and others, which you'll look for when you buy a cycle helmet or something. And they help consumers make choices for things which are suitable for their purposes. In an international context, an approach which I think is particularly appropriate for our discussion is the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, which is based in Switzerland, which looks at providing different sorts of quality standards and accreditation for different types of activity, whether it's manufacturing or services or what have you. The one which I think is most appropriate for us in our context is the ISO 9000 series, and particularly the ISO 9001-2008 variety, which provides you some form of external accreditation. So the idea in this is that you are audited based on stipulating that you've met certain standards, and what it does is certifies that the processes which you need to do in your organization are being applied consistently and effectively to meet your goals and objectives. Okay. So some background of where this comes from and some of the tools that you can use. Two key points which I think are very important to highlight: people and processes. The importance of leadership and staff development in transforming organizations, and this links in, I think, to the idea of specific training in the area of assessment for different types of stakeholder, the idea of assessment literacy, both within your organization and also within the stakeholder group that you're servicing, and then processes. The importance of defining processes and managing them effectively to provide the basis for improvement. So the appropriate documentation using standard operating procedures and mechanisms for storage and retrieval in documentation terms. So let's start with the people first, and so we don't lose the perspective. A key asset in achieving error-free processes in organizations are the people. So the managers or the leaders need to ensure that the staff in the organizations are empowered to carry out their responsibilities. And they can employ the QC and QA procedures which come out of this approach to ensure that all involved contribute to quality. If they don't, if this is spotted, then the idea perhaps is not to sack them because you want to retain people, but to develop the expertise in the organization. The recruitment is important, but also ongoing training and professional development. And that's not just because they're doing things wrong, but also to enhance capabilities, keeping up with changes and innovation. Okay, core processes. This is the term that is used, the core processes. And this is really defining what the organization is doing at a macro level. And in assessment, I would argue that there is a five-stage assessment cycle. So if you look at Bachman, or if you look at Fulton Davidson, or if you look at any of the other handbooks, they have these stages, or these aspects within a cycle. They may call them different things, but you can boil it down to these five things. Planning and designing a test ab initio, development of the system and the procedures for ongoing test assembly, routine delivery of a test and its administration, the routine processing in terms of the marking or rating, the grading, and the issue of results, and the review and hopefully evaluation of tests as part of a validation program. Now, if you translate that into a QM model, then you get what is called a process interactions map. So it's not just a question of having those things seen in isolation, it's also how they fit together. So this is on the handout, so you can read this from left to right. And you can see that the input from one part of the process is the output from the other. So those interfaces are particularly important to manage because you risk having one team do it over here and another team doing it over there, and they don't actually fit together very well. And that's where management comes in. And those loopbacks in blue, one loopback is focusing on the improvements of the processes, that is how you're doing the work, and the other loopback is to the test itself, to the concept of the test, the constructs, and how it's designed. And this, in a sense, is an ongoing activity. The ISO people talk of this as a plan, do, check, act model. Because in any process, mistakes, inaccuracies, human error, in our case, things like malpractice or cheating, impact on the quality of what we do, and in our case, threaten the validity argument. And so what you're trying to do is not only spot it, but anticipate it in advance and try and put in processes to prevent it. If you do spot it, then it's a question of iterating, going back into the cycle and trying to put it right. And it's not just a question of correcting mistakes, because at a certain point you evaluate what you're doing and saying, well, okay, let's do it differently and better. Because there's always room for improvement, and there's no such thing as a perfect model. So in terms of an assessment process, figure 2 shows how the aims feed into as inputs and then outputs of the different phases of the cycle, both in terms of a development process at the beginning and then an ongoing iterative model. And you can see coming out of each of those little white boxes are arrows leading into a little blue box which says evidence. And this is the collection of the data, information, feedback, whatever you want to call it, which helps you to know what's going on and then to find ways to improve it. If it's going wrong badly, obviously to put it right quickly. So the activities of quality control and quality assurance in practice are to do with checking and then acting. Quality control is synonymous with checking things. Systematic checks are needed at all stages of a workflow to meet the standards as defined and described in documentation and clearly specified for each stage of the overall process. But here's where the people come in. The checks are not carried out by some external department, perhaps called the quality control department. These need to be instigated and carried out by the people doing the task. It's their responsibility. Ultimately, they are then able to collect enough information to monitor and evaluate what they're doing in order to then come up with ideas to improve it, which is going back to re-engineer perhaps one aspect of the process. So if you evaluate the core process and find they're not working as well as you like, then it's beholden on you to try and find ways to do it better. So you can see this in just to illustrate very briefly, that in assembling tests, a prerequisite would be to have specifications. The specifications then generate the instructions to item writers for assembling tests on an ongoing basis. But they also provide the basis for doing all kinds of other checks at various stages of a process, which might go through many phases until you come up with the material which is ready to then go into a storage facility, so that the material is ready for when you need to select it, pull it out, use it in a live test. And of course, in complex organizations, you'd need an item banking system and very sophisticated methods to categorize and retrieve the material. So in this kind of approach, the QA system would deal with having an ID perhaps for every single item so that you can identify it, a checklist to track this progress, a complete record of everything that was done to each item or set of materials, a record of decision making that gives you a document trail back to see who was involved. Test materials being stored and readily accessible with the document close to it, not separated out where you can't find it. And rules for access and confidentiality so that people who are not entitled to can't get hold of secure materials or pass them on to people who shouldn't have them. Of course, I think one area which is often neglected in this is administering tests, because we devolve the administration of tests to other people quite often. So in large-scale operations, the administration will be delegated to personnel at testing venues, perhaps in many parts of the world. The test developer needs to be confident that the assessments are administered in a standardized way, because consistency is important. Uncontrolled variation here certainly undermines validity. Administrative procedures, therefore, need to be clearly and comprehensively described and produced in a format which can be used under those operational conditions. It's a form of communication which deals with, I won't go into detail, all of these kind of things: the physical setting, the storage of the material, the personnel who are needed, their recruitment, their training, their management, their payment, the interaction between those people and the test takers or other people at test venues, how to lay out the room, give out the test papers, collect them in, monitor for cheating or other malpractice, and dealing with unforeseen eventualities, because you're probably also responsible for the health and safety of the people, so fire alarms, accidents, power cuts, and so on, which, if not controlled, lead to tests being chaotic. Okay, so that's a brief run-through just to illustrate the kind of things I've got in mind here. And there are, of course, many, many more. But the argument here is that I think you should be able to see there's a link here, an intrinsic link between quality features and the validation argument. Failure to maintain the quality of any aspect of the system threatens validity, and we can see some from the examples I gave. Undetected problems here may lead to construct irrelevant variance creeping in that may affect some of the test takers, all of the test takers, or just one or two individuals, and thus lead to unfair outcomes. And you can look at the work of Antti Kuhnen on this question of fairness. So, what I'm arguing here is that the validation process is one of accumulating evidence to support the inferences made using test results, and that there is a clear synergy between test validation and the quality concept of continual improvement. And they both require the accrual of evidence, information, for making decisions at all stages in the cycle. So here we have the figure 3, which is the same one as in figure 2, but showing the feedback loops, which we saw on figure 1, which are not simply to make sure we're doing it right, but also to find ways in which we can do it better, and to improve the test system and the service we provide to our clients as we go forward. So there's a virtuous cycle of continual improvement if this is used. So, just to summarize in my 20 minutes, the message here is this provides us a way of putting our principles which you'll find in our code of practice of ILTA or ALTE or APA, into practice in real-world context, the context where we are providing services to clients, or could be in the school system, but in our case today in the workplace, for the workforce. And we argue that this approach, the QMS approach, can help to bring about change or transformation within organizations and the improvements which are needed. But it also does it in a well-managed and principled way, which can be communicated to people, and people are responsible for doing it and know what has to be done. We can also connect to good practice in language assessment with operational procedures which are both transparent and accountable, thus allowing us to account for what we do to sponsors or regulators, whether they're the ICAO regulators or the Ministry of Education or our clients in the world of work. And what I'm suggesting is that the ISO approach to quality standards, which looks at a model of auditing as a way of dealing with checking out what's happening, can be used in conjunction with a suitable international code of practice, let's say it's the ILTA one, in order to provide the basis for error-free processes which are necessary for validity, and to achieve auditable professional standards which may be necessary for all kinds of other reasons. So, with that, I'll just refer you to some of the references on the handout, and thank you for your attention.